What exactly is goaltender interference in the NHL? Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? Bueller? Don't worry about the confusion because you know what? Gary Bettman's got an answer for you. Well, earlier this week, NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman made a kind of I guess to media and fans, a surprise visit to Montreal, apparently simply to take in a Canadiens Bruins game, and made himself available to reporters for about 20 minutes prior to puck drop on the game that night. I have a feedback forum question for you this week. If you had the opportunity to ask NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman one question, and one question only, what would it be? Today, we're going to give you 7 takeaways or thoughts from things that Gary Bettman talked about in that press conference, including questions about video review on goaltender interference. But first, what's one of Gary Bettman's favorite topics to talk about? Yes, the Arizona Coyotes and their viability out in the desert. It was put to him about his thoughts on the attendance numbers now that they are temporarily in Mullet Arena. And Gary Bettman, I think this comes to no surprise as anyone, came to the defense of the Coyotes and said, quote, "Every game has been sold out there. It's a question of standing room. They're going to be fine. They're doing better from a gate standpoint in the small building than they were doing in Glendale." He went on to say that he was absolutely convinced that when a new arena is built, that they will be able to sell a good portion and sell out, a 16,000 seat arena. So, okay, Gary, okay, let's see it happen now. While we're talking about numbers, the salary cap, of course, came up. And you'll recall, initially back in the fall, Gary Bettman had said that the salary cap next year would probably go up by somewhere between $3 and $5 million. Then he walked that back in December and announced, oh, no. It's only going to go up by $1 million next year. And everyone kind of went, oh, all right, that's a big difference. Well, now this week, he's now making it even more of a gray area and I guess doesn't want to be held to a specific number. So he's giving himself some wiggle room once again. He says, if there's still some escrow outstanding, then the cap goes up by $1 million. But if our revenues are even higher than we're projecting, say $150 million, don't hold me to that number, give or take, it's conceivable, and he repeats, conceivable, that the escrow will be paid off, in which case we use a different formula and the cap would go up by a greater number. So if this was the answer from the get-go, why didn't he just say that in the fall? It's conceivable that maybe it could be higher than $1 million. You know how it goes every year for the draft, and it is certainly this year no exception with Connor Bedard on the table. We hear a lot about our teams going to tank to increase their chances to get that number 1 overall pick. Well, Gary Bettman said there is no such thing as tanking in the NHL. In fact, he says, nobody tanks because we have a weighted lottery. You're not going to lose games to increase your odds by a couple of percentage points. That's silly. And frankly, suggesting tanking, I believe, is inconsistent with the professionalism that our players and our coaches have. Nobody tanks. Our players and our coaches do their best to win. And again, just because you may finish with the worst record in the league, you've got something like a 75% chance that you're not going to get the first pick. So Gary Bettman does not want you to think that the tank is on at all. And I will split this decision with him. I do believe that players will never be on board with losing intentionally. That's just not built into a professional athlete's DNA. And I believe coaches are there as well. So yes, I think that he's correct when he says coaches and players are still going to try to win. Absolutely. And I don't believe that there's any true management decision ever for a team to say we are intentionally going to be as bad as we can be. But team management can put things into play to, not make their teams quite as successful as they could be when the cards are on the table and a team is having a pretty poor season or there's a really big piece of the puzzle that's missing. You can't tell me that GMs aren't a little tempted to try to at least skew the odds in their favor a little bit. But Bettman was very firm. There is no tanking in the NHL. Excuse me, Mr. Bettman, when will the Montreal Canadiens host an outdoor game? They won't. Next question. That's essentially what happened when Gary Bettman was asked if the Canadiens will get their shot at hosting a home city outdoor game. And he basically said, it's not going to happen. The Olympic Stadium has a roof on it. So unless you're taking the roof off of that, that's not a viable option. And the stadium at McGill is too small. The venue doesn't work. So he in no short order just said, it's not going to happen. It's just not. But what about a game in Europe? We've seen that the NHL has committed to this initiative more and more pre-pandemic and is starting to try to get back to that of playing a couple of games, in the beginning of the season over in Europe. Gary Bettman did have some positive inclinations towards that in terms of the Montreal Canadiens. In fact, he mentioned that there is an owners committee that focuses on international play, and that Jeff Molson is actually a co-chair of that committee. So it is no surprise with that news that, of course, the committee is looking at the Montreal Canadiens as being a target team to play in Europe. Bettman says lots of things have to be taken into consideration. It's a considerable cost financially, and there's other factors involved. But we could see the Habs playing across the pond at some point soon. While we're on the subject of what ifs and possibilities, of course the Nordiques came up. Of course Quebec City came up. Gary Bettman had to say, no, we are not in an expansion mode right now. So no, we are not currently looking at a new city to add another NHL franchise. But when asked, did confirm that despite what anyone else has said or speculation, Jeff Molson has assured Gary Bettman over and over and over throughout the years that if Quebec City were to be awarded another NHL team, if the Nordiques were to come back, that Jeff Molson would be fully supportive of that and would not have a problem with it. And I'll let you take that as you will. So that brings us to the big question. Video review for goaltender interference. Is there possibly over the last couple of seasons a more controversial topic in and night out in NHL games? I don't think so. You hear it from fans on social media. You hear the media talking about it. You hear broadcasters talking about it. You hear coaches talking about it. You even sometimes hear GMs talking about it, that there is such an inconsistency and an inability to really pinpoint what is and what isn't goaltender interference in the NHL. It seems to change on a nightly basis, on a game-to-game basis, in a city-to-city basis, depending on which officials are running things for each game. It is a frustrating sticking point that there just doesn't seem to be a clear-cut answer. And so there's been a lot of talk and chatter lately that coaches are getting a little frustrated because the video review process, when a coach challenges for goaltender interference, it seems to be kind of this thing that's completely up in the air. What does the commissioner have to say about it? Well, the commissioner here is here to tell you that, listen, there's no controversy, and it's really much more cut and dry than is being discussed. And frankly, he believes that most of what's being discussed is purely driven by the fact that people, coaches, whomever, just don't like the outcomes of those video reviews. Let me quote him. People sometimes say they don't understand something when they don't like the result. It's a judgment call. We're very comfortable with the way the calls are being made, particularly with video review. You shouldn't make any challenge unless you're certain that it should be overturned, and I think that's the bigger issue. You shouldn't be using the coach's challenge unless you're certain that a mistake was made, not that you'd like to see a different result. And there you have it. It's not on Gary Bettman's NHL referees. It's not on the war room in Toronto. It's all about coaches and teams. Just, you really have to stop using the coach's challenge as a way to try to weasel an overturn on a call on the ice. Well, maybe if it was clearer what constitutes goaltender interference and what doesn't, then perhaps coaches would have a better informed way to make a decision as to whether or not they should challenge. Because as Bettman says, you shouldn't make any challenge unless you're certain that it should be overturned. If the rule is so ambiguous that coaches and their staff can't determine if they really think it's going to be overturned or not, or should be, then how is that the fault of a coach? This is one of the rules in the NHL that absolutely needs to be looked at, overhauled, rewritten, so that it is much more specific and the officials in the war room have to get on the same page as to what constitutes it and what doesn't. I understand there's a lot of gray area when it comes to goaltender interference. There's a ton of it. But there are also ways that you can kind of draw a line and say, this definitely is and this definitely isn't. The call that didn't go Montreal's way, I agreed with that one because Sam Montembeault, his entire body was out of the paint. There was a skate blade left in the paint. And he even kind of jokingly afterwards said, yeah, I mean, if I had made some miraculous dive back, maybe I could have saved that. So there was no goaltender interference there. But there are so many times where you see goaltenders in the paint literally getting interfered with, and it doesn't get called or it doesn't get overturned. Make it make sense, NHL. Make it make sense. Don't forget that feedback forum question that I did mention earlier in the show. Drop that comment down below. Let me know if you had the opportunity to ask Gary Bettman one question in a press conference. What would be the thing that you would want to put to the NHL Commissioner? Do want to give a shout out to some of the people who dropped comments last week talking about the reaction to Kent Hughes's mid-season press conference that he held. We'd love to hear from you as well, so drop your comments down below. Guess what? Next week, we're making predictions. That's right. In the lead up to the NHL All-Star break, we're going to make some predictions about the skills competition, and we're going to give you the ins and outs of a few unique new events that have been added to the skills competition. So if you've really enjoyed this show and you want to hear my predictions for the All-Star skills competition, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, tap that notification bell, like this show. We would really appreciate it. And then I will see you back here again next week for another episode of Habs Hockey Report.